So recording now, and I'm meeting everybody now as well. Awesome. Hello everyone. Thanks for your patience in the waiting room. We're just waiting for the last couple of guests to join us from that waiting room. Lovely. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am currently seated, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. It is my absolute pleasure to be here with you all tonight for this discussion of the Palace letters with Jenny Hocking and Ginger Gorman. Before I hand you over to Jenny and Ginger, I'd just like to really quickly reiterate a little bit of the information that was sent to you in the email with your link to tonight's event. So you have all automatically been placed on mute and you'll remain so throughout the evening, but that doesn't mean that Jenny doesn't want to answer your questions. She certainly does. You can send them through to me via the chat box and I will then pass them along. If you can't see the chat box right now, it's towards the bottom left of your screen. And if you still can't find it, then don't worry. I'm going to be using it to post the link that you can use to purchase your copies of the Palace letters through us at Avid Reader. So when I do that, it will pop up. Type your questions in there and send them through to me as and when you think of them. And so that's all from me. I would now like to hand over to Ginger Gorman, who is a social justice journalist and the award-winning author of the book Troll Hunting, and who is in conversation with Jenny Hocking tonight. So Ginger, over to you.
So much. Thank you, Emma Kate. It is so lovely to be here, and thank you all for joining us. I know at this stage of the year, a lot of us are zoomed out, so it's lovely to be here. I'd also like to acknowledge we're on Aboriginal land and this always will be Aboriginal land. So I would also like to thank Avid Reader. Last year I was launching my book at Avid Reader and it's a shame we can't all be at Avid Reader. It's a beautiful bookshop if you haven't been there in person, but still this is the next best thing. I hope you've also all got a wine or a cup of tea or a drink. This is going to be quite a relaxed evening. Jenny's a great person to have a chat with. So if you're anything like me, you probably studied the controversial historic dismissal of Gough Whitlam's government by the then Governor-General Sir John Kerr in 1975 at school, at university, or maybe you're of the generation like my late dad, which lived through this era. It's not an exaggeration to say that this chain of events is still likely the biggest upheaval in Australian political history. This is approximately the 45th anniversary of the so-called constitutional crisis, and Professor Jenny Hocking has recently released an astounding book. Here it is. I hope you've all got it, and if you don't have it, you should buy it. It's The Palace Letters, the Queen, the Governor-General, and the Plot to Dismiss Gough Whitlam. And listen, it does read like a thriller. I just could not put it down. So these pages really rewrite the history of the dismissal. Emeritus Professor Jenny Hocking is an award-winning biographer. Her books include an acclaimed 2-volume biography of Gough Whitlam. She's also a political commentator from Monash University in Melbourne. This book is actually her 8th single author book, and she's jointly edited several more as well. So Jenny spent 10 years at an extraordinary 4-year legal battle, which went all the way to the High Court, so Australia's highest court, obviously, to get access to the Palace letters. Jenny, thank you for joining us, and I just could not be more thrilled to talk to you this evening.
Thanks so much, Ginger. And I also want to thank Avid Books and Emma Kate and Ginger Gorman, of course, for being a wonderful in-conversationalist, and also Scribe Books and Henry Rosenblum, because they did an extraordinary job in having this book out by late October, and I couldn't be more delighted. So thanks everybody, and thanks to you all for coming, and please do ask your questions. I'm very happy to answer questions at the end.
Yeah, so we're going to be looking at your questions. Emma Kate's going to curate them, send them to me. So please chat away in the chat box as we go. Make sure they're questions, not rants, and we'll answer them at the end. Jenny, let's start with some basics. What are the Palace letters and why are they so important?
Well, the palace letters are letters between the Queen and through her private secretary, Sir Martin Charteris, and the Governor General, Sir John Kerr. They cover the time of the dismissal of the Whitlam government, the unprecedented action by Sir John Kerr in removing the elected government from office. And so, of course, they're absolutely critical documents in our history. And they're all the more critical because the history of the dismissal has been so clouded, so uncertain, and I found in the last decade in particular that it's been very much a distorted history, largely through omission. And so, of course, seeing these extraordinarily important letters, that they are in our own archives, but that we couldn't look at them, that was just, for a historian, that was an appalling situation, but also for an Australian. I think anybody would have looked at them and said, how is it possible that the Queen is preventing us from looking at such important documents in our history? So vital letters that until this year were unknown to us.
And it's interesting to think about a history constantly changing. Like, the history that you have uncovered is so different from what I learnt about in university in regards to the dismissal. You know, I thought this one guy, Sir John Kerr, did it. And actually what you've uncovered is so different from that. But before we get into the detail of what's actually in those letters and the High Court battle, which is, frankly, I think I said to you, when I read about it, and the more I read about what you'd gone through, it was like The Castle, the movie, crossed with a sort of spy thriller. It was almost unreal, the whole thing. And I hope one day someone makes an amazing movie about it where you're the star. But how did you first find out that these letters existed? Because they weren't known to the public.
Well, they weren't known in the nature that we now understand them. We did know that Governors General wrote what they called reports or dispatches back to Buckingham Palace, sometimes 4 times a year, perhaps maybe only once a year. And governors do that as well, which is in itself quite remarkable. Malcolm Turnbull says in his wonderful foreword to my book that it's a bit like the branch office writing back to head office. And it's a very odd situation that our Governor General should be reporting back to Buckingham Palace in this way, but that was the norm. So we knew that Kerr was writing what he called dispatches, but there was no sense that there were literally hundreds of letters, as we found out during the court case, that there were 212 letters. Given the sort of quarterly reports from other governors and other governors general, you might have expected perhaps 16 letters. So it was clear once the court case got underway just how unusual these letters were. And when I was looking at Kerr's papers, which I opened up when I was doing the biography of Whitlam, so that's more than 10, 15 years ago now, there was one set of files that was not available to me. There were many that I couldn't access, but you could find out a little bit about them. But these had simply said personal correspondence with Buckingham Palace, completely closed. And so that's where I first got a sense that they were something quite important and more significant than we'd probably understood them to be. Kerr had mentioned them in his memoirs. He simply referred to them as regular dispatches to the Queen. Other governors general have mentioned them. Some of them have been released over the years, but in a very patchy way. So we're facing a situation where at the most critical and politically controversial moment in our history, our Governor General is writing to the Queen. He is her representative in Australia, and yet we could not look at those materials, even though we knew they were so significant to our history. And that's when I suppose I thought, well, if there's anything I could do to get access to them, I would, but I couldn't actually pursue that for about another, really the best part of another decade.
So it's so interesting how the case almost unfolded, and reading the book, it was almost like you were following breadcrumbs. What gave you the sense, though, that it was almost like, as a journalist, we would say it was a big story and you get almost a gut feeling about it? Did you have the feeling that these was something that, you know, because you're almost like a bulldog, you wouldn't let go of it? So
well,
why?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And the reason was that I had found so much material in Kerr's papers already that told us what the letters were about. And that's the critical factor. is the key reason why they were closed by the archives was that they were designated personal, not Commonwealth records, therefore they didn't come under the Archives Act. And the reason they were designated personal in turn was simply that that's what had always been done for royal correspondence. Royal correspondence in all of the Commonwealth nations, and particularly in the UK, you cannot access. It's more difficult than, opening the Royal Mint to try and access the Queen's correspondence. And so the notion of royal secrecy was alive and well and existed in our own National Archives. Now, the difficulty with ever overturning that is you can never find the material that you can then make a court case to say, no, this is wrong, because of course it's secret. So there's a unique set of circumstances here where my research into Kerr's papers, when I was both looking at Whitlam's biography, but also later with the dismissal dossier, I had uncovered a massive material where Kerr actually cited from the palace letters. I'd found some excerpts of the letters. I'd found a journal where he quotes from them. I'd found other details where he listed his conversations with Sir Martin Charteris, and he called it his advice on the dismissal, that Charteris gave him advice on dismissal. So it was clear that Kerr saw these letters with the Queen as part of his advice that he was receiving on dismissal. It was clear they knew about the possibility of dismissal well in advance. And so that's the material we were able to take to the court. And yes, I did know that they were absolutely critical, because by that time, to be perfectly frank, I probably knew more about the palace letters, even though they weren't yet open, than anybody in Australia because of Kerr's papers.
So there's so many things in there I want to pull out, Jenny, but I want to just go back a little bit and circle back to some of these things you've just said in a second. But why do you think 45 years later, we are all just so riveted by the dismissal? Like when I said to my friends and my nerdy political friends, I was interviewing you, all the ears pricked up. The dismissal, everybody's riveted. Why? What do you think it holds us transfixed all these years later?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting thing, Ginger. There's no doubt about that. The dismissal continues to exercise us and animate us, and to a certain extent divide, although I think the history now is becoming more settled. I think the reason for that is twofold. The first is that the event in itself is momentous. I mean, an unprecedented situation that you have a government and a prime minister that retains the confidence of the House of Representatives at all times, and this is the critical factor, in fact, a motion of confidence was passed that afternoon, reinforcing that, calling on the Governor-General to reinstate the Whitlam government, which the Governor-General chose to ignore. Nevertheless, you have a Governor-General who dismissed that government and placed in office the head of the party that had lost the previous two elections, Malcolm Fraser. Now, that in itself, you can see just how extraordinary that series of events was. And of course, that continues to create debate. It continues to be a critical moment in our political and constitutional history. But there's a secondary reason why we continue to be fascinated today. And it's a very simple one, and it comes down to the fact of secrecy. Not only the secrecy surrounding the dismissal itself, it demanded secrecy from the Prime Minister at the time, but the secrecy from the history subsequently. I mean, as you said earlier, so much of this history has come about because of archival research in the last 15 years, and that has dramatically transformed that history, so that what had been presented as a solo act by a lonely and agonised a Governor-General who was forced to make this decision, we now know there were many other people, including Sir Anthony Mason, a High Court Justice at the time, who had engaged with Kerr over many weeks, advising him, counselling him. Mason even wrote a letter of dismissal for Kerr. And that role was completely secret for 37 years until I uncovered it in Kerr's papers. So, it's a remarkable thing to think that history can be kept from us. It can be kept secret. But in the dismissal, it was. And so every time there's been a new revelation, which in recent years has been quite frequent, there's another burst of interest. And that's really why, is because we're still finding out what happened.
And to me, it goes to a deep Australian sense of fairness. We don't like things that are unfair. We don't like that we elected a government that was dismissed by somebody we didn't elect. We don't like that something that's clearly related to people's public office is described as personal and kept secret. Like, there's a deep rankling in our guts about this that's not actually that intellectual. It's like a rage that people have about it.
Yeah, I think particularly once the court case began, I was astonished by, and pleased, delighted by how many people became involved. I was running a crowdfunding campaign as well to try and cover the costs, even though I had a magnificent pro bono, legal team. There's immense costs associated with such a case. And people from all around Australia, hundreds of people contributed whatever they could. And I was just so enormously grateful. And, they weren't necessarily always people who thought the dismissal itself was appalling. Although there were many of them, but there were many, many people who simply felt it was a shocking situation that key historical documents in our archives could be embargoed on the instructions of the Queen. And again, this was something that really only became clarified during the court case. To my astonishment, we'd always been told that the letters were embargoed by Kerr himself, that he had placed this embargo over them. And it was only once the court case got underway and we asked, under the strictures of law and a court case, to see these relevant documents, and the archives had to release them, that it became clear that actually that embargo, the form of the embargo, the specific nature of the embargo, had been placed by the Queen only weeks after Kerr's death. There was a very important wording change to Kerr's own conditions, changed by the Queen to enable her private secretary effectively to have a lasting veto over their release. That was critical, not only because it showed that this was a royal imperative, but because it got to the question of how can they be personal? How can they be personal if someone else can come in and change those terms? It actually was a really important part of the legal argument.
And this issue of it being personal came back again and again. Like, it's extraordinary to me that anything that's written while you're serving in a public office, the Governor General wrote those letters in his capacity as Governor General. Sir Martin Charteris wrote the letters in his capacity serving the Queen. Like, it's really baffling to me that anyone could ever claim that those letters are personal, Jenny.
Well, and the High Court agreed with that.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about the court case, though, shall we? Because that's significant, and how we got to the High Court. So in December 2016, you began this federal court action against the National Archives of Australia. So why did you do that?
Well, I did it really because I was in a position where I could do it. And that was because it was many years after I'd first sought access to the Palace letters, and had done so several times and been rebuffed each time. I'd also tried an FOI request direct to Government House, being rebuffed there. But I had, there's a lot of what appears to be a sort of serendipitous meeting or serendipitous occurrences throughout this that have ended up with this court case. And this was one. I'd released a book called The Dismissal Dossier, Everything You Were Never Meant to Know About November 1975. And in that, I'd really detailed everything I'd found out about the dismissal. I wanted to write in a short, sharp, 5 or 6 brief chapters, what we knew and what we hadn't known before. So I was really pleased to have the opportunity to do that. It was a great little book. And just as I finished it, and a lot of it towards the end of it was about the fact that we still couldn't know our history. We still couldn't know the full story because the Palace letters weren't released to us. I happened to read online a wonderful article by Sydney barrister Tom Brennan, simply called Australia Owns Its History. And he was saying, very briefly and legally, we should be able to access these letters under the Archives Act. And I was so taken by this because it was exactly parallel to what I'd been arguing from a political science point of view, that I contacted Tom out of the blue and said, look, I've read your article, it's exactly right, I completely agree. And he said, come in and see me, I'm reading the dismissal dossier. So I went in to see him a short while later. And if there's a lesson in this, it's don't go and speak to a Sydney barrister with a great idea, because you might come out with a court case. But from that, we started talking about the possibility of a legal action. And Tom very strongly believed that the material I'd put together, that he was reading in the dismissal dossier, could form the empirical basis for a legal action. But it was only because of his generosity working on a pro bono basis. The other barristers, we had Anthony Whitlam QC at the Federal Court, Brett Walker SC on appeal and at the High Court, and Cause Chambers Westgarth instructing, all of them magnificent and working on a pro bono basis. So it was only that quite unexpected a confluence of people, interests, and I suppose knowledge that enabled this to come together. And it was just a remarkable experience for me as well.
And for those people listening, Anthony Whitlam QC is Gough Whitlam's oldest son. So it's actually fascinating that he was in your legal team in the federal court case.
In the federal court. And he's so like his father. It was really quite, at times, quite breathtaking to see him stand up, you know, very tall and speak in that very deep, measured way. Very reminiscent of Gough Whitlam himself. So there were some marvellous circularities throughout the case, which I go through at various points in my book, The Palace Letters. And I think it's one of the things that makes it such a readable, pacey book, because there are all these different elements coming in and out.
And it's funny, Jenny, obviously, like I interviewed Anthony Whitlam for the podcast I did with you about the book as well. And he was so reserved. But when I said to him, did you not find Sir John Kerr a bit swami? He did laugh. Right. So he was very measured, though. He was very reserved, I've got to say. We'll talk about John Kerr's personality in a second, but this case did go all the way to the High Court. You lost in the federal court, you lost on appeal, and then unbelievably, you ended up in the highest court in the land. You won the High Court case, which I just still find astounding. And this is absolutely unprecedented. How did you feel in that moment when you won that High Court case and you essentially learned you were going to get access to these letters, which you had been barred from for 10 years?
Oh, look, it was an extraordinary day. I was tremendously nervous, waiting for the decision. We knew it was being handed down at 9:30 that morning. And because of COVID, of course, no one could be, neither the judges nor me, could be in Canberra to receive the verdict. They were actually in Brisbane with the decision being handed down through by video link into the High Court in Canberra. I was in Melbourne, flicking between the High Court's Twitter feed and my emails. And I got a text from Terry King, who'd been working with me on media the whole way through, and it just had one word with a lot of exclamation marks: yes. And honestly, it was the most amazing feeling. I was just elated for history, because the history had been blocked around the question of these letters. I knew how tremendously important they were, what a wonderful addition they would be to our understanding of the dismissal, as indeed they have been. And I was so grateful, of course, to the legal team, but also to all of the supporters who'd contributed and kept me going along the way. So it was a wonderful day. It's a day I'll never forget. And I do want to say about the decision, it's a 6-1 emphatic decision from our High Court. And, you know, I do know that I'll never have that experience of being heard by the High Court before, but it was an extraordinary experience. And it gives you great faith in the legal process to know that you're before 7 of these remarkable legal minds, just so precise, so quick. The things they picked up, the different barristers about that I knew were later important in the judgments, were really quite breathtaking. And that experience in itself was fascinating. And the judgment's extremely important. The reason it's so important is not just because we get to see these remarkable letters, but royal secrecy, which, as I said earlier, has been almost unchallengeable, has now been really significantly chipped away, because throughout the Commonwealth nations, you cannot access royal materials. And, you know, I know that Julia Baird, when she wrote her biography of Queen Victoria, sought access to Queen Victoria's letters from, you know, well over 100 years ago, and found that impossible to deal with the Royal Archives. And this has now created a precedent where royal secrecy throughout the other Commonwealth nations, and perhaps even in Australia, it should be the case in Australia and in the States as well, that we start to unravel that and actually allow the Queen to become part of our normal processes of governance.
Oh, congratulations, Jenny. Honestly, I take my hat off to you. I think it's incredible what you've done. I mean, I interview academics all the time. This is a very unusual thing that academic work would end up forming the basis of a High Court case. And then not only that, but you had all the public buy-in and so forth. So, you know, really, I bow down to you. But there's a lot of significant issues here still. Like, I was very concerned, you know, as someone who believes in social justice, and, you know, I live here in Canberra. The archives are meant to be an institution that gives us access to our own history and our own records. They spent $2 million stopping you getting access to these documents. I mean, what kind of a public institution is this? Are they actually serving the taxpayer, or are they just spending our money keeping our documents from us, you know?
Yeah. Look, that became increasingly troubling to me. Initially, I could understand why there was a view that the letters had been placed under an embargo. They said by Kerr, and he was the depositor. They were called personal, therefore, well, you can't access them. But the longer this went on and the more I sought access to related records, it became clear that there was something else going on there, that Kerr himself hadn't actually put that embargo, the Queen had, and that this was just always what the archives had accepted from Government House and from Buckingham Palace. But there was some real intrigue, which I go into in the book, that shocks many people to see that key documentation was actually, in terms of the instrument deposit of a copy of the Palace letters, was actually redone midway through the case, which tossed out effectively half of our case, and that was overseen by the archives. Very, very troubling. And as you say, the cost to the archives budget was escalating with every new part of the court case. They put their own costs at $1 million, but it's actually double that, because in losing at the High Court also issued three cost orders against the archives, that they pay all of my costs back to the federal court. And that has made their total costs closer to $2 million. And I have to say, this is one of the things that I think has been of greatest concern, that they present themselves as what they call a pro-disclosure organisation. They are tasked with keeping our history and our historical memory for us. And yet they fought tooth and nail together with Buckingham Palace and Government House to prevent access to these records. And I just want to say one thing about the priorities of the archives. They have lost about 25% of their staff in the last decade. They've had really, really difficult budget constraints, as all the collecting organisations have. And for that, they've said at Senate estimates just a couple of weeks ago that they have some really important audiovisual material, including original tape recordings of Indigenous languages, that are now at risk of disintegration because they don't have the money to put them onto audiovisual form. Now, sorry, into digital form. Now, this is a really, really difficult set of priorities to spend $2 million on a case effectively fighting a request for public access.
Yes.
To their records.
And
there are aspects of that I think many people are being critical of, and I certainly am in the book. I find it very, very difficult.
There was a page in here which I had to read twice, because you said you'd been waiting 9 years for some of your requests. Yes. And yes. I read it twice and thought, did she just say 9 years? So, you know, hugely problematic. And I think we could probably spend an hour just talking about this. We are going to go to people's questions in a minute, so keep them coming. I just really have a couple of things I want to ask you about. I mean, I could talk to you all night, Jenny, because I'm just totally riveted by all of this. But I know you learned many things writing the letters, and if people want to read the letters, they are online. They're all online now, finally, because of Jenny. You can go and look at them. But the thing that really struck me, like reading your book, and I went and I read some of the letters, is I thought, what a weak and insecure little man. I know he was huge, Anthony Whitlam told me. So not in stature, but his personality seemed so insecure. So what did you make of Sir John Kerr by the time you'd finished reading all those letters?
Oh, look, it's appalling, really, to read his letters. They are He's a deeply troubled man. He's completely deferential to Buckingham Palace. He's in their thrall. Malcolm Turnbull describes it as, in the introduction to the Palace Letters, he says Kerr's sycophantic grovelling is stomach churning. And it's a wonderful description because unfortunately it's true. I mean, Kerr, I find it embarrassing to read it both personally for Kerr, but also again as an Australian who's seeing our Governor General behave in this way. He's desperately in need of the approbation of the palace. And, you know, I have to remind myself that this is a man who had come from being Chief Justice of the New South Wales Supreme Court, a man at the pinnacle of, you know, a stellar legal career, to be absolutely, as Turnbull said, grovelling to the appointed official of the private secretary of the Queen. It's quite remarkable. And that's the first thing that strikes you. Now, I'd known, as I said, quite a bit about the letters, a lot about the letters, but I was still struck by the nature and the relentless nature of that relationship displayed by Kerr. Far more troubling and surprising was the extent to which Sir Martin Charteris, speaking of course on behalf of the Queen, engages with Kerr on what are essentially profoundly political matters. And the critical thing to remember at all times when you're looking at the letters and assessing the letters is two things: that as a constitutional monarch, the Queen and the Governor-General must remain politically neutral at all times. They do not, we're told, and they tell us this and affirm this, they do not get involved in any discussion of political matters. Now, that is so important and so central to the nature of a constitutional monarchy that it's actually on the Buckingham Palace website. It actually says there, the Queen as a constitutional monarch who remains politically neutral at all times. The second thing to keep in mind, because clearly that's not the case in these letters, the second thing to keep in mind is what's called often the cardinal principle of a Governor-General in a constitutional monarchy, is to act on advice. They act on the advice of elected government so long as that government retains the confidence of the lower house, the House of Representatives, as Whitlam did at all times. Both of those critical functions are breached, and clearly breached, through the letters.
They really are. I was actually blown away, like quite shocked. Now, listen, this is going to be my last question, even though I could ask you a million because our audience is asking us some great questions. But very unusually, Jenny, for an academic book, you really put yourself into this book. It's true narrative nonfiction. It does read like a thriller. And I wonder if you could just quickly comment for us about that process for you, because that's quite unusual as well.
Yeah, look, it's very interesting. I've actually enjoyed this, to write in the first person. I've never done that before. And as you said, having written, 7 or 8 other books as well, it was always at a distance. I was always writing about either something theoretical or another subject being my biographical subject. And to write this from the first person and my own experience has been a challenge, but I'm really glad that Scribe and Henry Rosenbloom in particular encouraged me to do that. And he said to me, it's your story. No one else could write this. It's your journey through the High Court. And I'm really glad I did, because I've always loved detective stories. I love Agatha Christie, Hercule Poirot, and I love that sense of forensic unravelling. And I also love the archives. And if anything, where I'm critical of the archives, I hope people will realise that comes from a position of someone who really loves archival research and who recognises the great historical value of original archival research. And it's a position of great concern about where our archives is at the moment. So what I loved about this book was being able to adopt this almost like a persona of a detective unravelling material as it came to hand. And as you said, each piece led to another piece, and I could sense that it was royal secrecy was unravelling as we went through it and we were building a case. And the other highly unusual aspect of it is that it was a process of, I suppose, a theoretical alchemy where what began as historical research became part of a legal action. And I saw this shift from the history incorporating into the law, and that's fascinating too. So none of that, I think, that sense of excitement, the difficulties, the obstacles I faced, I think I think it had to be a position of my story. And in the end, I forgot that it was the I word was me, and I just saw myself as another character in the book. And I must say, I really enjoyed it. I felt to some extent liberated to be able to reflect on what happened. And I think it was a great experience. I think that shows in the book.
It really does. And it's fun to read. Like, I read it in a couple of days, which is not usual for an academic book. There's no stuffiness to be seen. So listen, we're getting some great questions here, Jenny. So let's go straight to the questions. If you do have a question, get in quickly because we are running out of time rapidly. So Jenny, this is a question from David. He says, does it perhaps annoy you that the facts you have revealed now over many years are not well known by the Australian public, and that the versions of history such as from Kelly and Bramston are seen to be more accepted?
No, well, look, I would dispute that that's more accepted. I think most people now would not dispute that. The Palace letters clearly show that that these letters themselves affected the decision that Kerr made, and that's really always been the critical question. Were they involved? Did they know in advance that Kerr was considering dismissing the government? Absolutely, the letters show that. The critical letter from September 1975 confirms what I'd already found in Kerr's journal, which is that Kerr spoke to Prince Charles in Papua New Guinea in September 1975 and told him he was considering dismissing the government if supply was blocked, and that he was concerned Whitlam might seek his recall. That was relayed from Charles to the Queen, and from the Queen to Charteris, and Charteris wrote to Kerr about it in early October. So no doubt they knew far more than the Australian Prime Minister did. And no, it doesn't concern me that other people will try and say there's nothing in these letters. 200 letters tell us absolutely nothing that we didn't already know. I mean, if they want to take that view, that's fine. But I think the longer these letters are out there in the public domain, certainly, as the Monthly said, no respectable historian can continue to claim that these letters played no part in Kerr's decision. I mean, of course they did. And Kerr at some points actually asks Charteris to advise him. For example, he says in October, can you let me know of any matters related that will affect the monarchy in Australia that I may need to take account of when I make my decision? So he's quite explicit in seeking the input from Buckingham Palace into the matters that he's considering and into his final decision. And that's the critical question here. Were these letters a part of the involvement of the Palace in Kerr's decision? Absolutely.
It's fairly inarguable. You can't, once you delve into them. Another question, has there been any comparable case of a constitutional swindle heavily influenced by the Palace perpetrated on any other Commonwealth country?
Well,
yes.
Yeah, very interesting question. I mean, the way I would answer that is to say, well, we just wouldn't know. I mean, we would not know the extent to which the Palace was discussing critical matters like the use of the reserve powers, allowing Kerr to act against the clear advice of the Solicitor General, which he lets the Palace know he is waiting for in late October, and because they have been kept from us and elsewhere in other Commonwealth nations, these letters are simply not possible. So it's been a unique aspect of the situation, both in terms of archival research, but also in terms of the history, that we've been able to gather enough material to create a court case that has gone all the way to the High Court and convinced the High Court of Australia that these letters were not personal, that they were discussing matters of an official nature, as Justice Flick said in dissent at the full federal court, matters that go to the heart of the operation of democracy in this country. And so that's the strange thing about those who continue to say, but there's nothing here. I mean, in a sense, the High Court has already found there is something here, because they are not personal reflections on matters immaterial to their functions and office. And that, in fact, was conceded by the archives very early on in the case, when they conceded that the letters actually deal with matters relating to the powers and functions of the Governor-General, as indeed they do.
They made a mistake though, didn't they? That was a tactical error on their part. We're going to go to a couple more questions, but Emma Kate has put the link to buy Jenny's wonderful book, The Palace Letters, from Avid Reader. Go and buy it. You won't be sorry. Buy it for people for Christmas. It's a great read.
Hocking in every stocking.
I feel like as well, like, not it's a shame lockdown has ended, but this is like the perfect lockdown book because you just actually don't want to get out of bed. You just want to read it cover to cover. So Peter's asking, or he's commenting, I remember the rage in many public sections at the dismissal, but it was gone by the time the election came. Could Australia not countenance a coup and the Queen and Prince Charles being traitors to Australia? It's an interesting question.
It is interesting that the dismissal itself changed everything. It's often forgotten in terms of the politics of the time. It's often forgotten because so many of the histories don't mention it, but I do, that in the weeks during which the supply in the Senate, those bills were blocked by, of course, the opposition in the Senate. During those 4 weeks in which the supply bills were blocked and the opposition refused to pass the bills, they didn't reject them. They refused to pass them, demanding an election. And Whitlam, of course, had decided to call the House Senate election, which he was to do on the 11th of November, when instead Kerr dismissed him without warning. But it's often forgotten that if you look at the opinion polls, and there were not many because they're very expensive to run at that time, but there are some critical ones during the 4 weeks that supply was blocked. There was the most dramatic turnaround against the opposition during those 4 weeks. Popular opinion was that the blocking of supply was a disaster. It should never have happened. There was 1 week in which the Fraser opposition had lost 10 percentage points in a single week. And there was a very important opinion poll about the Senate election alone, the House Senate election, which came out on the 4th of November. And that showed that support for the opposition had plummeted so significantly that the Whitlam government was in a real chance of actually picking up the Senate at the House Senate election, and for a brief period, for constitutional algebraic reasons that I won't go into, could have had control of the Senate for 6 months up until the following July. And there are particular reasons for that. But that shift in opinion polls towards the government was quite dramatic. It's well known. It's well known. If you look at some of the early histories, they do refer to it. That changed immediately upon the dismissal. The sense in which dismissal damaged the Whitlam government, which became the Whitlam opposition, was profound. And all of the opinion polls, it just drained out the other way because, of course, the fact of dismissal and unprecedented action, there was a sense there was something else happening when we don't know the full story. The government must have been corrupt. All these rumours were easy to spread. And, of course, the government no longer had all of the benefits of incumbency. The opposition had it. So they didn't have control over the levers of government anymore. They were now in opposition. And the British High Commissioner in London, Sir Maurice James, wrote a very poignant piece shortly after the election, and he said something along the lines of, never has a single action of a Governor-General so dramatically affected the electoral fortunes of a government as the dismissal. He was very troubled by it, and Maurice James wrote some very interesting memos afterwards, some of which I put in the Palace letters. It was a really difficult time for so many people. And I've often said there were no winners in the dismissal except for Malcolm Fraser, because Kerr was largely destroyed by it. And certainly Whitlam's political career was destroyed by it.
But it's interesting, Jenny, isn't it? Because when I was, at the ABC, we thought of Malcolm Fraser very much as an older statesman. But when I was reading your book, I thought, wow, he was really part of this conniving plot to actually dismiss the government. Like, I actually thought of him in quite a different way. It really threw a different light on him.
Oh, well, he, of course, was, he was the driving force. It was the opposition that wanted to be in government when it hadn't won the last 2 elections. And I say, particularly in my biography of Whitlam, that the one thing that told against the Whitlam government, I think more than anything else, was that it had come in after 23 years of consecutive Conservative government. And that unchanged period of Conservative government had really made things almost, well, it turned out to be impossible for a new Labor government, but very, very difficult, because almost the entire post-war period had been done in a particular way, and it was the now opposition Liberal Country Party did not readily accept that. They said that this was an illegitimate government from the outset, and there were many pockets in the public service that found it very difficult to work with a new type of government. So there were strains all round, and I think that told very heavily on the Whitlam government.
And it'd be great if we had time to talk about the policies of the Whitlam government, but we don't. But I just want to take this one last question from David, which I think is an interesting one. In hindsight, could Whitlam have done anything more apart from sending the Speaker to Yarralummla following the vote of confidence to save his government?
Yeah, look, this has often been raised about why didn't Whitlam do something else? And I asked Whitlam, obviously I interviewed Whitlam when I worked on the biography, and he was very generous with his time. And what the thing to understand about Gough Whitlam that is both a great aspect of his political beliefs, but also I think displayed itself as a form of political naivety, is that he was a massive believer in the institutions of governance. He was a great institutionalist. In that sense, he was conservative institutionally. He often spoke, you know, in this wonderful prose that he was such a good speaker about his belief in the great institutions of the United Nations and their associated institutions, the international institutions, the parliamentary system, which he strongly believed in as the best means of achieving peaceful political change. And as he always said, and the great Australian Labor Party. And those are the critical institutions in his life. He believed, because he'd grown up in Canberra, his father was Crown Solicitor, and he'd grown up with these institutions, with the different people in the institutions. He understood how the institution should work. And it's extraordinary to think about it now, but he seriously believed that on the afternoon of the 11th of November, he would be back in office, because supply had been passed by the Senate, as he'd been trying to get it passed for the previous 4 weeks, and the House of Representatives voted no confidence by 10 votes in the appointed Fraser government. And that same motion, which is a critical motion, often left out of the history books, critical motion also called on the Governor-General to reinstate the Whitlam government, to recall a government led by the member for Werriwa, that is Gough Whitlam. Now, what I call the second dismissal then took place. The Speaker tried to see the Governor-General. The Governor-General refused to see the Speaker, refused to acknowledge that critical motion of the formation of government from the House of Representatives, again, an unprecedented decision by the Governor-General, and instead dissolved both Houses of Parliament with Malcolm Fraser still in office. So that is the critical aspect. Whitlam could not have been expected to foresee that Kerr and Fraser would ignore that motion of the House of Representatives. It is the sacred motion of the House of Representatives, because it is how our governments are always formed, on the floor of the House. You know that from the arguments about whether a government loses a motion on the floor of the House. It's the critical determining factor, and it was not acknowledged at that time. So, you know, I now think that it wouldn't have mattered what Whitlam had done. Kerr was determined, and in fact, he said in one of his letters to Sir Walter Crocker, the South Australian governor, he said that he was not prepared to put Whitlam back in office, because, as he said, that would have overturned the whole exercise, and the exercise was to call the double dissolution. But he should have enabled Whitlam to make that call himself, and his failure to warn Whitlam was, I think, Kerr's great moral failing.
It's incredible. Well, there's moral failures all through it. Anyway, Jenny, we will have to leave it there, even though I could listen to you all night. So, Emeritus Professor Jenny Hocking, thank you so much.
Thanks so much,
This is her walk. Oh, what a pleasure. It's just been such an honour to talk to you. Professor Jenny Hocking has written this book. Buy it in the link that Emma Kate has put below in the chat. The Palace Letters, the Queen, the Governor-General, and the Plot to Dismiss Gough Whitlam.
Thanks.
Back to you, Emma Kate. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you, Ginger, and thank you, Jenny. It's been such a great discussion, and thank you all for joining us tonight and sending through those great questions, which really contributed to it. It's been an absolute pleasure to host. We're getting messages through the chat box saying thank you. So yeah, I'll now invite you, if you would all like to do so, to take yourselves off mute so that you can join me in thanking Ginger and Jenny for this evening's discussion. Thank you so much. You should be able to take yourselves off now. Thanks, everybody. I can see pizza coming off. Thank you.
Thank
Have
you.
a lovely rest of the evening, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks again, Emma Kate. Thanks, Ginger.
Thank you.
Thanks.